Hollywood wasn't just glitz, glamour, and red carpets. Behind the cameras were geniuses, and some of the strangest, quirkiest personalities you could imagine. John Ford looked like a grizzled tough guy, but secretly he was quietly helping families survive the Great Depression. Orson Welles hated his own nose and turned prosthetic disguises into a form of art, hiding insecurities behind theatrical flair. Federico Fellini didn't just make movies, he brought his bizarre hallucinatory dreams to life on screen. Brilliant, eccentric, unforgettable. Are you ready to uncover the weird genius behind the films you love? Let's dive in. 1. John Ford, the tough guy with a hidden softness. If you picture legendary director John Ford, the first image that might come to mind is that of a stern, rugged man, eye patch on, capped pulled low, jacket worn like armor. He looked more like a grizzled sea captain than an artist, and that was no accident. Ford worked hard to cultivate this tough, almost friendly exterior. In interviews, he gave the shortest, bluntest answers possible, as if daring journalists to dig deeper. On film sets, he projected the image of a no-nonsense commander barking at actors, especially poor John Wayne, whom he teased relentlessly. But behind that crusty mask was a man very different. For example, Ford had peculiar habits whilst working. He demanded English-style tea breaks during shooting and sometimes insisted on live music being played on set. Even stranger, he had a nervous ritual of chewing through handkerchiefs during takes, destroying several in a single day. Yet the real oddity wasn't in his habits but in his contradictions. For all his bullying bluster, Ford was secretly generous, enormously so. During the Great Depression, he quietly supported 22 families out of his own pocket. When struggling actors or crew members came to him for help, Ford would put on a show of anger, storm away, only to have an assistant hand them the money they desperately needed. Why the theatrics? His brother once explained, Ford simply couldn't bear to be thanked. He had built a fortress of toughness around himself, protecting a deeply sensitive, even tender heart. If people knew exactly what a softy Jack really was, his brother said, the legend of John Ford would fall apart. And so Ford lived a double life. The world saw the gruff, intimidating general of cinema, but in truth, he was a man who cared too much, hiding his kindness behind a mask of iron. 2. Orson Welles, the genius who hated his own nose. Orson Welles was larger than life in every way. A child prodigy who shook the world of theatre, terrified radio listeners with his infamous War of the Worlds broadcast, and at just 25 years old gave cinema Citizen Kane, a film still hailed as one of the greatest ever made. He was a writer, actor, magician, director, a man of endless talents and endless appetites. But despite his towering presence, Welles carried with him a surprising insecurity. He despised his own nose. He thought it was too small, too babyish, too unsuited for the dramatic roles he played. To the world, he was bold, charismatic, and powerful. To himself, he sometimes looked in the mirror and saw a depraved baby, as he once put it. His solution? Prosthetic noses. Welles had a whole collection of them, which he wore in films, on stage, and sometimes even at home. Each nose had its own personality, and he would even use them in his magic tricks to amuse guests. Unlike many stars who concealed their insecurities, Welles made a kind of theatre out of his. He joked about it on television, telling audiences that the only reason he looked different on screen was because, at that moment, he wasn't wearing his fake nose. What makes this quirk so revealing is that it shows the two sides of Welles, the genius who could transform anything into art, and the man who never quite felt comfortable in his own skin. He could dazzle the world with innovation, but behind the spectacle, he was always wrestling with private doubts. And maybe that's why his films still resonate. They aren't just grand experiments, they're deeply human, shaped by a man who knew both brilliance and insecurity. In Orson Welles, genius and vulnerability went hand in hand, sometimes under the guise of a false nose. 3. James Whale, the gentleman of horror with a secret life. When Universal Studios struck gold with Frankenstein in 1931, the man behind the camera suddenly found himself with more freedom than almost any director of his time. That man was James Whale. Unlike most filmmakers of the studio era who had to follow orders and stick to rigid scripts, Whale was allowed to shape his films with his own style. He added sly humor, stylish visuals, and even a touch of camp. It was rare, unheard of really, that a director could bend Hollywood to his vision in the early 1930s. But Whale wasn't only unusual in his career, he was unusual in his life. At a time when being openly gay could destroy a man's reputation, Whale chose neither to hide nor to advertise his identity. He simply lived as himself. And it didn't seem to harm him one bit. In fact, his wit and charm made him popular among actors and producers. Later critics would argue that Bride of Frankenstein had a coded gay sensibility, filled with playful exaggeration and theatrical flourishes. Whale's close friends, however, insisted he never sat down with such intentions. He simply wanted to make an entertaining, mischievous film, and in doing so, created one of the great classics of cinema. In his later years, Whale retired from Hollywood and enjoyed a quieter life in California, but even then, he couldn't resist a bit of mischief. He often hosted pool parties for his circle of friends, though Whale himself couldn't swim a stroke. There was always something playful, something just a little ironic about the man who had given the world monsters and lived his own life on his own terms. 4. Todd Browning, the circus man who shocked Hollywood. If James Whale made horror stylish, Todd Browning made it unsettling. Long before Frankenstein, Browning brought Dracula to the screen in 1931, giving audiences their first real taste of gothic horror in Hollywood. But Browning's path to filmmaking was stranger than fiction. Born in Kentucky in 1880, he ran away from home as a teenager and joined the circus, not as a clown or a juggler, but as the living corpse, a morbid act where he was buried alive on stage. This early fascination with the macabre never left him. Later in Hollywood, he forged a partnership with the great Lon Chaney, the man of 1,000 faces. Together they created films filled with grotesque characters and dark atmospheres. But Browning's most infamous film came in 1932, Freaks. Using real sideshow performers, he told a story about betrayal, revenge, and humanity. Audiences were horrified, some fainted, others demanded the film be banned. MGM quickly pulled it from theaters, and Browning's career never fully recovered. What he had thought of as a tragic human story was simply too much for his time. Off the screen, Browning was just as unusual. He and his wife were known to be compulsive kleptomaniacs, stealing jewelry, trinkets, even gemstones. Despite being a successful Hollywood director, he couldn't resist taking what wasn't his. Old circus instincts, perhaps. At the MGM commissary, he even found ways to sneak meals without paying full price. In many ways, Browning lived as though he never truly left the circus, part showman, part trickster, part shadowy figure who loved the dark corners of human experience. To the public, he was the director who frightened the world with Freaks, but to those who knew him privately, he was a man forever haunted by the sideshows of his youth. 5. Frank Capra, the patriot with puzzling politics. When you think of Frank Capra, you probably think of warmth, laughter, and hope. His films, It Happened One Night, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and It's a Wonderful Life, were like love letters to American values. They celebrated honesty, democracy, and the belief that one person really could make a difference. During the dark days of the Great Depression and World War II, Capra's movies lifted spirits and gave audiences a sense of faith in the future. But behind the camera, Capra himself was far more complicated, and some would say downright contradictory. For one, while his films often championed new ideals, Capra was no fan of Franklin Roosevelt. In fact, he was a lifelong Republican and a fierce anti-communist. During the McCarthy era, he even supported loyalty oaths, something that feels very different from the generous community-first spirit of his movies. Even stranger, Capra admired figures like Benito Mussolini and Francisco Franco in the 1930s, a view that seems almost impossible to square with films like Meet John Doe, which warned against fascism and championed American democracy. How could the same man who gave us the ultimate Christmas story of love and redemption also praise dictators abroad? The contradictions didn't stop there. The FBI once questioned whether It's a Wonderful Life was secretly communist propaganda because of its villain, a ruthless banker. Imagine that. A film now cherished as a wholesome holiday tradition was once suspected of being anti-American. For Capra, the accusation cut deep. He saw himself as the very embodiment of the American dream, an immigrant boy who rose from poverty to the heights of Hollywood. Yet the country he loved sometimes misunderstood him, just as he sometimes misunderstood it. Perhaps that is what made Capra so unusual. He was a man torn between ideals and politics, between what he believed and what he filmed, and maybe that tension is what gave his movies their lasting power. They were hopeful, yes, but rooted in the messy contradictions of real life. 6. Federico Fellini, filming his strange dreams. Some directors tell stories. Federico Fellini told dreams. His films, La Dolce Vita, 8½, Amarcord, weren't just movies, they were surreal journeys into a world where fantasy and reality walked hand in hand. So distinct was his style that critics even coined a word for it, Fellini-esque. But the strangest part of Fellini's story is how much of it came from deep inside his own imagination. And one particularly unusual experience. In the summer of 1964, Fellini underwent a single, intense psychoanalytic session that profoundly influenced his creative vision. He later said the insight he gained left a mark that lasted a lifetime. Fellini described the experience as both heaven and hell at once, something beyond words. He spoke of colors so intense they felt alive, of emotions so vast they defied language. Critics and scholars believed this session influenced the wild colors and dreamlike structure of his later films. In fact, one of his short films, Toby Dammit, is considered the closest cinematic expression of what he imagined during that period. What's remarkable is how Fellini embraced his own strangeness. He didn't try to hide it. If his movies became more self-reflective, more about his own flaws and fascinations, he leaned into it. He turned his quirks into art. For Fellini, life and cinema were inseparable. His eccentric visions weren't distractions, they were the point, and through them, he showed the world that even the strangest, most personal dreams can become masterpieces. 7. Francis Ford Coppola, the family-focused maestro. Few directors have ever soared as high or fallen as hard as Francis Ford Coppola. In the 1970s, he seemed unstoppable. The Godfather Part 2, Apocalypse Now. These weren't just movies, they were cultural monuments. Coppola had the world at his feet, hailed as one of the greatest filmmakers alive. But Coppola himself often felt uneasy about that success. He once admitted he felt like he'd lived in an old man's career too young. The pressures of greatness weighed heavily, and when his ambitious musical, One from the Heart, flopped in 1982, he spent years buried in debt, struggling to keep his studio and reputation afloat. What made him unusual wasn't just his highs and lows, but the way he lived through them. While many directors kept their families at a distance from the chaos of Hollywood, Coppola did the opposite. Whenever he was away shooting for more than 10 days, he pulled his kids out of school and brought them along. His sets became not just workplaces, but playgrounds and classrooms. Sofia Coppola grew up wandering through the jungles of Apocalypse Now and the grand mansions of The Godfather. Coppola's spirit was restless too. He often said that you can't be an artist and be safe. Even after his glory days seemed behind him, he kept experimenting. He financed his own smaller films in the 1990s, and decades later he risked everything on Megalopolis, an experimental epic that baffled critics and audiences in 2024. But instead of retreating, Coppola doubled down, promising to recut the film and take it on tour, proudly declaring he wanted to make it more weird. Through triumph and disaster, Coppola has remained true to one principle. Filmmaking isn't just about pleasing audiences or playing it safe. It's about daring to create, to push, to risk, even if it means losing everything. That stubborn, fearless streak is what makes him one of cinema's most fascinating figures. Hollywood wasn't built by perfectionists. It was shaped by misfits, visionaries, and those bold enough to turn their quirks into art. If you loved exploring the secret lives of these legendary filmmakers, subscribe, comment, and share, and tell us which directors' eccentricities fascinated you the most.